although I restricted my eating quite savagely at times to compensate for binging, so it wasn't have a huge obesity problem, but I was terrified of getting diabetes because I
Mm-hmm.
knew that my relationship with sugar was just disordered. There was a lot of sugar. So I tried to give up sugar. And I tried some of the things that are available online, a 30-day challenge to give up sugar and all these kind of, absolutely could not do it. It was a fail, a huge fail. Could I be abstinent on sugar? No, there was no chance that I could be abstinent on sugar. And what I learned as I learned more about food as the years went on was that flour is sugar, pasta is sugar. All these carbohydrates are essentially just sugar. Trying to give up actual, crystallized table sugar or sugary drinks or sugary sweets, that to me not only was it a point for failure, but it was a point for discipline and willpower, and I was white knuckling it through, and I was always cravings, and the cravings didn't dissipate for me. But when I actually went abstinent from all sugar, which included carbohydrate or almost all carbohydrate, I was able to give up sugar.
Today, I'm pleased to introduce to you my special guest, Shannon Harwood. Shannon Harwood works privately as a recovery keto coach. Her interests encompass lifestyle, mental health care, hyperbolic tapering principles, and the emerging field of metabolic psychiatry. She is passionate about the importance of metabolic health for individuals facing mental health challenges. Shannon's lived experience includes complete healing of mental illness after 35 years of living with experiences known by the diagnostic label of bipolar 2 disorder. In 2024, she was the recipient of the Metabolic Mind Award, which focuses on recovery and advocacy. Shannon is also an ambassador for the Equally Well organization in Australia. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Shannon. Shannon, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for asking me along. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. This will be interesting.
Absolutely. The first thing that I want to ask you is if you can please share your story. I know that can take some time and I really welcome that, but I'm so curious to hear your story, its details, and yeah, for you to fill in the audience that may not know your incredible story.
Okay, well, the reason I've washed up onto a podcast today is because I've started speaking publicly that healing is possible. And I go around and I say quite frequently that healing is possible. What degree of healing, how you might get healing, and what you might get healing for are all different. So I've listened to some of your guests, and I suppose my work with food began from a different place because for 35 years I lived in the world in a way that attracted a bipolar diagnosis. So for 35 years, I experienced bipolar disorder, hypomanic episodes, depressive episodes, huge amount of polypharmacy, hospitalizations, TMS, lots of withdrawals from the world as I dealt with serious mental illness in my life. And then one day I read that if epilepsy drugs were not working for people with epilepsy, they tried a ketogenic diet. And actually that a ketogenic diet had been used in epilepsy for 100 years. And that kind of blew my mind because if you've got bipolar disorder, you're probably taking drugs that were designed for epilepsy. I thought to myself, well, I'm taking all these drugs designed for epilepsy and they're not working. So maybe I'll look into this ketogenic diet. And then I started reading and looking into the ketogenic diet, and I began a ketogenic diet. And what unfolded for me was complete remission and complete healing from bipolar disorder. It then took me 3 years to taper off the medications, and I'd been prescribed 17 medications over the time, and I was on 4 or 5 of them at any one time. So it took me 3 years to taper off all the medications. And that was a very, very short Reader's Digest version of a bipolar healing. There's a lot more to it than that.
Mhm.
But what was fascinating to me and what I didn't expect, and I say to people now who might be thinking about using a ketogenic diet in mental illness or depression or anxiety or even just for brain fog, is that if I hadn't done a ketogenic diet for bipolar disorder and I was going to go back in time, I would have done a ketogenic diet for the healing of my relationship with food and more generally the healing of addictions. So I've been doing a ketogenic diet now for 4 years, and it's sort of a specific way that I do that, and we'll probably talk about some abstinence or moderation and how that works in my life. And in those 4 years, not only has my weight stabilized kind of effortlessly, which is amazing, but I no longer have binge eating episodes. I no longer have cravings around food. I no longer have significant control issues around food. For the first time in my life, my relationship with food is one of nourishment and wellness. And that's not something that I've experienced since I was stealing chocolate cake at the age of 12.
Mm.
So for that to happen now in my 50s is astonishing. And it's complicated and it's interesting, and it's brought me here to this podcast today. And when I was looking at my Kindle this morning, before I did this podcast, I was thinking, how many books on food are in my Kindle? And there's more books on food in my Kindle than there are about mental illness.
That story is absolutely amazing and super inspiring for other people who might have really severe challenges, and the power of the ketogenic diet in helping them with not only those challenges, but with sort of like naturally helping with food issues as well. One question I have is, I think that a lot of people want to adopt, a diet that feels, like that's free of ultra processed food, or that, some people want to adopt an abstinence-based diet. Not everyone, certainly, but some people want to, but they feel like they're really frustrated, but they can't. And I'm imagining that the 4 years that you've had, having this ketogenic, adopting this ketogenic diet and being able to experience like this enhanced clarity and this reduction of cravings. I'm imagining it was the whole gravity of the situation of having this severe mental illness that really sparked you to 100% go with this like actually ketogenic diet. But were there any hiccups? Like what advice do you have for someone who's like, okay, I'm interested, Shannon, this sounds great. I'm interested in having this food freedom, but how do you actually do it like in like a realistic sense?
Well, I think what you said there is so telling, because you just said, if someone came up to me and said, Shannon, I'm interested. So I think that sense of being curious and compassionate rather than judgmental, because a ketogenic diet wasn't the first thing that I tried. It wasn't even the first food intervention that I tried to heal, use for healing purposes in bipolar. So I tried other things before, because when I realized what was wrong with me had a label, and I started taking medications, but the medications weren't controlling the episodes of hypomania and depression. I went, well, what else can I do? So then it was sort of lifestyle therapies, and food's part of that. For example, I tried a gluten-free diet, which made me worse. And I'd never dieted before in my life. So I got to about the age of 40 and I'd never really dieted. I'd certainly binged and restricted, but I'd never sort of followed a diet,
Uh-huh.
And when I got diagnosed with bipolar, I did these things. Like I tried a gluten-free diet, but a gluten-free diet is still full of carbohydrate.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the carbohydrate that was my issue. And one of the things that interests me about your podcast and coming along today is that question of, where does binge eating stop and start, and food addiction stop and start? And that's a long debate over many decades, and they cross paths sometimes as well. I don't think there are necessarily always clear lines there. But when you're talking about someone, I'd like to try abstinence, but I don't feel that I can. I'll just tell you a little story as a jumping off point. So although I restricted my eating quite savagely at times to compensate for binging, so it wasn't have a huge obesity problem, but I was terrified of getting diabetes because I knew that my relationship with sugar was just disordered. There was a lot of sugar. So I tried to give up sugar. And I tried some of the things that are available online, a 30-day challenge to give up sugar and all these kind of, absolutely could not do it. It was a fail, a huge fail. Could I be abstinent on sugar? No, there was no chance that I could be abstinent on sugar. And what I learned as I learned more about food as the years went on was that flour is sugar, pasta is sugar. All these carbohydrates are essentially just sugar. Trying to give up actual, crystallized table sugar or sugary drinks or sugary sweets, that to me, not only was it a point for failure, but it was a point for discipline and willpower. And I was white knuckling it through, and I was always cravings, and the cravings didn't dissipate for me. But when I actually went abstinent from all sugar, which included carbohydrate or almost all carbohydrate, certainly all refined carbohydrate, I was able to give up sugar. So for me, my journey with abstinence has been really coming to terms with what is the substance that I might be having a problem with, and then would I consider abstinence for that? So I had to, but if I could just speak a little bit more, because this will, I had a moment, it was only about 18 months ago, actually, and I read Vera Tarman's Food Junkies, and I had just an epiphany, because suddenly I had the word food addiction in my lexicon, and it was, I never understood, for people doing, AA for alcohol and stuff, I never understood the concept of sort of admit that you have no control over the substance. There was a part of me that always thought, no, I have control and efficacy and agency, very big words in mental health recovery, agency, efficacy. And I read that book, and it was like a light bulb went off in my head, and I went, I have never been able to control sugar and carbohydrate in my life. And that is not a sign that I don't have willpower or that I don't have discipline, because I do. And I've done some astonishing things and some wonderful things. And that acceptance, that radical acceptance for me that this was essentially a substance use disorder, was a game changer, because I thought that I might have had a more sort of eating disorder like binge eating or non-purging bulimia. But now I don't know that I did, but I think there's crossovers. So for that person looking at, can I do abstinence? The first thing to ask is, do you need to do abstinence? Because if you're capable of doing moderation, I don't see any reason why anyone would ever choose to do abstinence.
Right. Yeah.
I would do moderation,
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that one thing that's standing out to me about your story as far as a practical tip is, you later on identified that you felt like you had a sugar and carb addiction akin to substance use problem. But if you were to try to moderate, well, in those terms, just giving up sugar alone, let's say like adding sugar to coffee or sugary drinks or just like the obvious forms of sugar is not enough. So like if someone would say to you, Shannon, it sounds amazing what you're doing. The abstinence giving you clarity, reducing cravings. Everything feels easier. You have better health. I want to do it too, but I can't seem to do it. It sounds like perhaps you would encourage them to think twice about what's included in their diet, because there's carbohydrates, sugar and carbohydrates in way more things that are just in table sugar or in sugary drinks that we, to maybe drastically lower your carbohydrates. For example, in your case, you're having a diet that is probably achieving, it's like therapeutic ketosis level. So it's like very low carbs. And maybe if they were to try to actually go to a very low carb sort of diet, then actually it might be easier. So it's kind of like this irony that what seems harder is actually easier. But if you do certain things like halfway, like include some carbohydrates, that might actually be harder.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, so when I started the ketogenic diet, I wasn't total abstinence of carbs, but I was total abstinence of refined carbohydrate and sugar. So, for example, I still ate broccoli.
Mm-hmm.
Broccoli has carbs.
Yep.
So it wasn't like complete carbs, but I was completely abstinent of all refined carbs. And I used to explain it like if I just like gave up that sugar in my coffee that you were talking about, I'd say, that's like an alcoholic who gives up vodka but keeps beer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because my bread rolls and my pastas, they were my beer. I might have given up sugar in my coffee, but I was still eating bread rolls and pasta, and so I was still always sort of had that substance. So for me, I dropped down to less than 20 grams of carbs a day to get into a clinical ketogenic diet,
Mm-hmm.
because I was using for mental health. But of that 20 grams of carbs, zero amount of refined carbs and zero amount of sugar or maple syrup or honey or none of that. No sweets, no sweet
Yeah.
tastes in that.
Yeah.
But still had carbohydrate in it, and it was just amazing. The cravings for. I mean, I went through a withdrawal. Don't get me wrong. There is a carb withdrawal that happens here. They call it the keto flu. It's not a
Mm-hmm.
it's not a flu about going to keto. It's a flu about coming out of carbohydrate. That's what the keto flu is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so I went through that, but then the cravings did really go away, and I never thought that I could do it. I never thought that I could give up toast. I never ever thought that I could give up toast, but suddenly the cravings, they just went away for it. But I still had some carbohydrate in my diet, and then I began to recognize that other things were still, I wouldn't call them hugely problematic, the things that were left, but there were a few things there. Nuts. I realized early on when I went keto that nuts, they talk in Alcoholics Anonymous, they often say that when people give up alcohol, there's all these lolly bowls that appear in the AA rooms because people
Mm,
swap an alcohol addiction for a sugar addiction.
right.
And what
Mm-hmm.
I found when I started doing this was that nuts became a thing for me. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I, I learned pretty early on that I really needed to limit nuts too, because
Yeah.
nuts have 17% carbohydrates and 100 grams of nuts. And once you eat too many nuts, you will throw yourself out of ketosis. And
Mm-hmm.
my aim was to use ketosis for therapy. That's sort of a bit of a digression from your question. So for that person who's considering abstinence, I guess the big question is to have a big enough why. I don't know. I'd be interested in your thoughts, Christine. I mean, where does binge eating stop and food addiction begin? And I certainly believe that binge eating with an emotional basis can lead into food addiction. I absolutely believe that can happen.
Yeah, no, I'm totally interested in that intersection as well. The intersection of binge eating and ultra processed food addiction. I feel like there's been a lot of dichotomization that perhaps doesn't reflect nuance and complexity and different sort of phenotypes that happen, because maybe it could start as an addiction and then it depends on how you're categorizing it too. I think that we're really lacking in these sort of descriptions at the moment because right now, food addiction is mostly categorized by as a substance use disorder. So then that would mean like ultra processed food addiction. But then how is it that people are having addictive and compulsive behaviors with items that are not necessarily ultra processed food? Because some people can absolutely go crazy once their whole system is dysregulated and they can be binging on tons of vegetables. They can be binging on, I've definitely binged on like crazy things, like vegetables, mustards, spices, like things that are not considered ultra processed food. So, but is that called binge eating? If we're having binge eating, is it only if it's emotional, only if it's related to body image concerns and weight preoccupations? I don't think so because a lot of my binging, I would say, didn't come from those sort of things. It feels like it's this entrenched pattern in the nervous system where we have somehow found food as a way to, if we're experiencing like distress, arousal, or just it doesn't even have to be something distressing, I believe. I believe that also there's kind of like it can become a habit. We're just having this automatic pattern. Let's say in the past it was related to ultra processed food addiction, and then that got us hooked, but then it just became a pattern. And then now it's 5 p.m. and this is what we do at 5 p.m. and it's not related to something being wrong. So I think there's a lot of the complexity, and I've been talking to different researchers about this because is it a process addiction? Is it a substance use addiction? Can it be both? Can it be sometimes one and then the other? And I don't think that there's enough like subtypes to describe all the different ways that it can manifest. And so I'm not huge with labels at the moment. I think that if someone is, having issues, then a lot of the same structure can be applied for many different things. I mean, I do think that important distinction is between if there's something that's more like would be healed by body image work and a moderation type approach, then that's one thing, right? And that's not really the focus of my work or my podcast or anything like that. I acknowledge that that's a need, but I'd say the majority of what I focus on, what's been my experience and how I mostly support people is through tools such as abstinent nutrition, self-compassion, sensory strategies, building awareness of one's own patterns and urges, and having emotional regulation strategies. Like all these things can be applied for someone whether they're binging on carrots or they're binging on ultra processed foods, having structure and restoring metabolic health, building that awareness of their patterns, developing strategies to help them, tapping into different forms of support, and really working from a multidisciplinary angle. I think that can help people regardless of a diagnosis, a specific diagnosis. Like, I mean, I don't think that there are the diagnostic tools available in general to say exactly what the things are. I think for example, I defy diagnosis. I'm both and I'm this and I'm some, I've been all over the place, but I think that the important thing is someone kind of having like a compass, like feeling like this draws me. Like if someone's like, I feel drawn to abstinence, like I've felt drawn to abstinence. Like my whole life I've felt like I really like clarity and structure and eating healthfully, and it never really landed with me to like eat, junk food every day because that's a part of like, that was part of my eating disorder treatment is like you should eat little bits of ice cream every day and all. It just never really landed with me. It never really worked. But for people that feel drawn to that sort of thing, I think that even just trying to implement it is hard enough as it is. Like even if they have this idea, like I think I need to do this, but I think the hard part is actually implementing it and making these sustainable changes and developing the skills to self-empower themselves to make changes over time as needed to have this sustainable recovery.
So many things I could pick up for on that. I used to work as a peer worker in mental health. All the strategies that you outlined there that come along, I think, with any journey. Maybe it's mostly a substance use problem, but yes, will that have emotional problem that's letting you use food, in a different way, so that they're all sort of interrelated. And I think what you said about diagnostic labels, I couldn't agree more. There are no discrete hard edges between these categories of things, but I think people intuitively perhaps get a feel of what sort of words they might like to use to
Right.
describe their own work, because I did a lot of the emotional healing work along this pathway too. And I think, our precursor emails, I said I can still self-soothe with food. I still use self-soothe food to
Mm-hmm.
self-soothe. I think that's quite a human behavior. And it is an out of control behavior for me? No, it's not at the moment. Did I used to use food to self-sabotage? Yes, I did. Was that an out of control behavior? Yeah, it was a little bit more out of control, and it was something much more difficult in my life. The self-sabotaging with food was more of a problem for me than self-soothing with food, So
Mm-hmm.
there's just a little difference with one person. And when I used to work as a peer worker, I used to say to people that I worked with, look, I'm going to come up with 100 strategies, right? And you're going to go, hard no, not interested, don't want to think about it, don't want to try it. Oh, yeah, that might be interesting. Or, oh, goodness, that's really interesting. I would like to give that a go.
Mm-hmm.
And whether someone's hard no, oh, maybe, or yes, that's an interesting idea. I think how you approach those strategies is going to change depending where you are on the pathway that you're going. So we almost get, full circle. And you mentioned this word there too in what you said about, compassion. Someone famous said it. I don't know who they are, but I can't remember. But, they say that thing where every failure is actually a point along the road to learning.
Right. Right.
And that is so important. And certainly if we were to use food addiction labels or addiction labels, relapse is absolutely part of the journey. I never expected to be where I am today. So if I'd have set out 4 years ago to be where I am today, not only could I not comprehend that, I certainly wouldn't have been able to begin it. And it would have probably frightened me. It frightened me enough. Food has such, you use the word hooks. I think so too. I think one of the big parts of my learning and curiosity and growth has been learning along the way that when things make me feel uncomfortable, then that's a moment to stop. Just to stop and examine that with a really compassionate curiosity. And maybe I'm not ready to work on it. And maybe I'm not ready to do a deep dive on it. And maybe even if I needed to feel that I needed to do a deep dive on it, maybe it's something that I should do that bit with support, because maybe the reason I don't want to do a deep dive of it is because I feel it's going to be really difficult. You don't have to know your end goal to begin something that's useful. And something else that you said too that's interesting is I met a woman once who had used self-harm cutting a lot in her life, and she'd resolved the issues, right, that had led to the self-harm cutting. And she was giving a lecture on the fact that once she'd done a lot of that emotional work and resolved a lot of trauma work, and she'd done, honestly, she'd just done so many good things. But she said at the end of the day, the last thing that she had to deal with the cutting behavior was the habit, because the cutting itself had become an addiction and the habit. So I don't think any of us, well, I'm not. I've got flaws and failings and maladapted behaviors and difficulties. But, some things I have had a good look at and I'm a lot more comfortable with now. But sometimes the habits can still, like, I'm sure my self-soothing with food is a habit that served an emotional need. If I had no history and no background and no previous experiences, and you just dropped me as I am into the world tomorrow, I don't think I would self-soothe, because I don't think I still have that same emotional driver that would lead me to self-soothe. But I'm Shannon Harwood in the world now, and when I've had a really difficult situation at work, or I'm really anxious or worried or upset, I'm actually activating an old pattern of emotional distress. But if you pop me in the world tomorrow, my patterns of emotional distress would probably never lead me to self-soothe with food, because they weren't substantial enough now.
Yeah, that is super interesting. We were chatting a little over email and you were describing something that I thought was super interesting. And I think it's relevant to what you're saying now, is this self-soothing behavior, which you aptly describe as very human. It's super, it's a human response for us to reach for anything that we can to regulate our nervous system. And as you and I and people watching or listening this know, is that it's effective to use food. It does shift our state, but the reason why we don't do that is because there's negative consequences, so it's not the most effective strategy. So we work to develop a broader toolkit with things that can regulate us, but that don't leave wreckage in the wake, like a binge on ice cream or whatever, right? Makes us feel like shit. You had mentioned a progression, that your behaviors were food were really different. And then adopting this ketogenic diet for your bipolar changed everything. And now you have much more quote unquote control over your food. The cravings are more of a whisper. But there are sometimes instances where you're self-soothing a little bit because you're human. And so you do, but I'm imagining it's on like a keto food or something like that. And then you mentioned that the food noise, maybe because of, for whatever reason, maybe you can explain why do you think the food noise came back, and but for whatever reason, the food noise afterwards comes back, but that you notice it like as very clearly, like whereas maybe when you're doing very strict ketogenic diet, it's like very little or no food noise. But then if you eat something, then you start to notice very clearly how that food impacts you because you notice the food noise come back a little bit, or like you could call it cravings come back a little bit. I'm just wondering if you could describe that because I thought that was like really interesting.
You're right, it is like cravings come back a little bit. So for me, if I think about how I used to be with food, I just had like a completely dysregulated relationship with carbohydrate and food. As I mentioned at the very start of this interview, I was stealing chocolate cake at 12. My first dip into hypomania coincided with a school chocolate fundraising drive,
Wow.
of which I was the treasurer and organizer.
Mm,
Now, so that was my first point, apart from, hiding lolly wrappers and things. That was my first point of substantial shame around food, that chocolate drive, because I had to pay all my pocket money to replace all the
mm,
chocolate that I ate because I was the person in charge of organizing the chocolate. And it was an unreasonable, and it probably also fed into that hypomania as well because there's a relationship there. So very, very noisy. And through the years, I lived with bipolar, unmedicated for a long time. Then with the introduction of medications, I had the addition on top of craving and a dysregulated relationship with carbohydrate. When I entered into the period of medications, compulsion
mm.
entered the scene as well, which is a side effect of antipsychotic use. So there's an edge of that on binge eating, but I had that before. But when you throw antipsychotics at it, for me, that ramped it up completely. So now I had unconscious nighttime eating, where I'd wake up in the morning and the kitchen bench would just be strewn with food, and I didn't know what I'd eaten.
Wow.
That's reasonably common for people who, that's why people, one of the reasons why people put on weight when they start using antipsychotics. They don't lose willpower. Other things are happening. They don't become a different human being and lose their willpower and discipline or self-respect. Those things don't happen. And so very, very noisy and lots of cravings and never able to moderate. And interestingly, I started the ketogenic diet. It still had some carbohydrate within it. All the refined and processed was gone. And the food noise cut out 98%. And I thought, well, that's amazing. That's just incredible. And yes, I noticed the nuts could make me a bit snackish and a bit moreish. So I sort of limited those. So I was still moderating some things. And because I'm curious, it occurred to me, well, in the old days, Shannon, you always wanted more. Now only occasionally. There's only some foods now that make me want more. Now all the refined carbohydrates and sugars are gone. There are still some foods that make me want more, but there's not many of them. And maybe I might play with taking them away. Maybe what would it be like to live in a world where no food has hooks into me and the only things I eat are for nourishment and wellness and none of them cause moorishness? Am
Mm,
I there? No, because heavy cream still really, that's a moreish food for me and I love it and it's in my diet, so, and I deal with the fact that that's moreish, but there was something about the predominance of carbohydrates that was more than moorishness that was well out of my control. As I learned that process was that, okay, so 98% of the food noise is gone, but now I notice, oh, hang on, oh, almond meal. Okay, so if I eat my almond meal bread, I can only have 2 slices a day because any more than that will put me out of ketosis, right? No, my aim is to stay in ketosis. But I would have to moderate that down to 2 slices a day. I would have to go, no, Shannon, you want more, but don't.
mhm,
Was the almond meal shouting at me from the kitchen bench? No, but the almond meal was saying, ooh, it'd
mm,
be nice to eat me, Shannon.
mm,
So in terms of food noise, it wasn't, use that metaphor, it wasn't shouting at me, it was talking to me.
mm,
And so then I took out the things out of the diet that were talking to me, right? And then I could start hearing the things in the diet that was whispering to me, like
mm,
the heavy cream. And so that led me to more experimentation with my diet. Now, don't get me wrong. This is because I'm curious. I could so keep these moreish foods in my life. Now that really troublesome foods have gone, I think most of us on many occasions are able to go, okay, well, I just won't eat any more of that. outside of a binge, obviously, but just in a normal occasion, I'll just have one sandwich for lunch. I won't have two.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that has my attention these days is the underlying interrelation of addiction. I smoked a pack a day for 30 years. I don't do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I was a daily marijuana user for 30 years. I don't do it anymore. I also went through a benzo addiction during this tapering. And so all these addictions in my life, it seems to me, even when I told that story about people at AA swapping their alcohol addiction for a sugar addiction, there has been something for me in returning to a way of eating that I do honestly believe is an ancestral way of eating. The agrarian revolution was 11,000 years ago. If I'd have been born 11,001 years ago, I would never have attracted a bipolar disorder label, because I never would have been exposed to the kind of diet that set off the kind of pattern in my life that attracts a diagnosis of bipolar. So 11,001 years ago, no meals for Shannon. I return my diet to something that looks more like something that we've evolved to eat, and not only have the hooks and cravings and addictions in relation to diet gone, but I've been able to deal with addictions in other areas of my life. And to me now, it seems, that there is a fundamental pathway of addiction. And I think perhaps once this is a personal belief, but I think my belief for myself is that once I've been addicted to any substance in my life, the idea of being able to alter my state, like you were saying with self-soothing, it's very effective. It alters your state, the idea of altering my state, whether that's with marijuana, vodka, cigarettes, food, recreational drugs. I know, my brain knows, and I know that there is a altered state out there. And if I'd never had any addiction, I don't think I would have known that there was a place of altered state out there.
I wonder sometimes about the confluence of all those different factors of the things that are available in our society, the foods and the advertising and the culture and our genetics, and how all these things interact to facilitate people's addictions and vices, and how in past times or in other possible worlds, or however we want to say it, that these wouldn't exist. I've thought about that. I sometimes have dreams of like moving to like a forest and just living, in the forest, in a place free of gas stations and convenience stores and artificial light, and just live on the land. Because I fully believe that my severe binge eating disorder that I had, that only existed because of various reasons that were related to society, and, like the things that were able to spring forth epigenetically, and from the fact that, the foods that were around in my culture and in my society, and these sort of things. And so I've been like, can't I just move to like a forest, and then I can live, this like more ancestrally, and have like the healthiest, most natural food, and my circadian rhythm is going to be, I'm just going to be completely an enlightened being. And but then reality of this lifetime takes over and is like, Christina, you don't know how to take care of yourself in the wild. You'll die. You'll die after like 3 days. You're gonna eat some like weird mushrooms, and then like you're just gonna die. But like I do think about sometimes like all the different factors that come into play, that is it's an unfortunate reality of the modern world that we live in.
Can I leave one thought with people who might be listening to this? Because there's lots of little bits that you might, if you're listening, that you might think, oh, I might go and research food addiction, or oh, I might go and look at circadian rhythms. But there was one thing that I did, because this healing from bipolar and this healing from food, these have taken years and years and years, and lots of strategies. I do lots of different things. It wasn't just like, oh, I started the ketogenic diet and everything was tickety-boo. It hasn't worked like that. But one thing I did was I realized that as I did this, I could make changes that would make a difference. I realized that. But I also realized that there were lots of levels and lots of layers and lots of angles, and I couldn't work on everything all at once. And some things I might be ready for later, and some things I might be ready for now. But that whatever was going to happen, my mantra is, how good can I get it? I don't know how good I can get it yet, because I'm still doing it, right? And that's the point, because tomorrow I won't have finished. So if it's going to take a while, and if it's going to be unfolding, and if it's going to lead you to places that you can't even imagine yet, and if you're going to end up trying things and experimenting with things that you thought were impossible but become possible along the way. For me, one of the important things that I did along the way was I thought, and this is one example of it, but everybody would have a different way of doing this. One of the things I did along the way, right, was I used to put on a piece of music and I used to dance like a mad woman, the kind of dance when nobody can see you, the John Travolta, the whole, whole thing, just the most ridiculousness. And I took being ridiculous privately in my own
Mm.
home as a gift to myself, because living with mental illness is hard, because shame, scales, stepping on the scales, stepping off the scales, cleaning up the kitchen in the morning, it's hard. And I knew that I was going to do hard stuff, and I knew that I was going to succeed at some of it, but I wanted to give myself something now. And for me, what I did was I gave myself a piece of ridiculousness, and I did it deliberately. So if you're coming into this and you're thinking, I don't know if I can do this and I can do that, some of that will unfold over time. But is there anything that you can put in your life for 30 seconds, for 5 minutes, that is for you now? Because you can't wait until everything's fixed, or I can't, because I've got too many problems and it's going to take me a lifetime to fix them. So I have to do it now. Yeah.
I love that, the power of the ridiculous, because I think that in the road to recovery, it can feel like a slog. It feels like, oh my God, it's an endless cry fest. It's an endless uncovering of past trauma and like trying to deal with optimizing our personal relationships. And there's just like so much like white knuckling and willpower and like just difficulty, right? So serious. But I think that if we can flip that a little bit and just see where we can encounter or create moments of joy, moments of
Yeah.
silliness. I personally like the like dancing in your living room in your underwear, or like like or in your car, like a car dance is always a good one, so I like those sort of things just to move your body, bring levity, and try to bring, like when we're reflecting on how we can, improve our situation or, whatever things that we can do to support our recovery, can we do it in a way that is like constructive, and compassionate and a little bit more lighthearted so that it doesn't all feel like, oh man, like this is all just like so hard and so dark and so shitty. But like, what can we do? Like, we could do expressive arts, like if we can draw about certain things or like, write a poem about certain things, do painting, like dance to express ourselves, just instead of just like swirling in our minds about stuff. So I love what you said, and I do those things too. I don't know about John Travolta. I like to imagine I'm like an Instagram twerk champion. Those are kind of,
Yeah.
that's my style.
And for some people, I understand that dancing and the body thing can be difficult, but they could be easy things. If you give yourself a big cheesy wink in the mirror, like a huge big cheesy wink in the mirror, it's ridiculous. And that's the point. The point is, it has no point, because as you say, sometimes it can feel like a slog when we do all this stuff that is ultimately beneficial. Of course it is. But yeah, sometimes it can feel like a slog.
Well, thank you for leaving us with that power of the ridiculous, that tip for all of us in our recovery. Thank you so much for being here, Shannon. Is like if people want to get in touch with you, do you have like a website or, email address or somewhere to direct people, maybe an Instagram page?
I'm not a huge social media person. I'm focusing on some other things at the moment, but you will find me on LinkedIn. And towards the end of this year, I think you'll find me back actively in the coaching space where I work with people who wanting to get into ketogenic therapy, most just generally ketogenic therapy, but specifically for people who are experiencing mental health challenges or serious mental illness. Yeah.
Okay, great. If you have any links, I'll make sure to get them from you and I'll include them in the episode description. Besides that, it's
Just
been a pleasure to have you, Shannon, and it's been great to hear your wisdom and to hear more about your story. It is absolutely incredible. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today.